Before I introduce our panellists, all incredible women who will help shape this year's election coverage in very different ways, I'd like to pay tribute to another incredible woman, Di Edward-Jones, who sadly passed away at the weekend. She was a director, an innovator and a trailblazer who led election night coverage over a 35-year career with ITN. I'm sure a lot of you will have seen her work, even if you don't know her name. She made an enormous contribution to television history, as well as that election coverage. Her election night task has been compared to playing 3D chess at Wimbledon pace over the course of a marathon. I hope that other women will be inspired by her example and continue to push journalism and production boundaries in the way that she did. So now let's meet our esteemed panel. First of all, Debbie Ramsay, who is the very excellent editor of Channel 5 News. She's also worked at BBC Radio and TV and Channel 4, and she is passionate about audiences and making sure news is accessible, relatable and relevant to all. Pippa Crerar is political editor of The Guardian. She was previously political editor at the Daily Mirror, where I'm sure you know she reported extensively on Partygate, which culminated in the resignation of Boris Johnson eventually. That's not a comment. She is the perfect person to have on our panel. In a world of fake news, AI, and the importance of safeguarding journalism that can be trusted, who better to join us than Georgina Lee, who is news editor of Fact Checked and Data at Channel 4 News, an increasingly important role. She recently addressed the House of Commons Digital, Culture, Media and Sport Committee about how to fight misinformation. And finally, Beth Rigby, who's the first woman political editor at Sky News, where she's also a presenter and podcaster, and she loves to ask those questions that some others wouldn't dare. So tonight we will be asking them about women in the media. Are we getting enough representation in the positions of power, and their unique viewpoints as we roll into a series of high-stake elections? Really, what are the big issues that we all need to be aware of? So thank you, panel. Really pleased to have you with us. And as we were saying, every day is busy in politics, and thank goodness that you're not stuck somewhere talking Rwanda so far. The night is young. But I want to first of all talk about really the role of media currently, your roles, and as we navigate what audiences are looking for, and those real challenges that range from political apathy through to disengaged youth and the climate we're working in. So I want to start with Beth. We've got May local elections coming up, and then at some point, I'm not going to ask you when, a general election with very, very high stakes. What do you think is the role of media currently within all of this?
Well, I mean, even though there are many ways in which political parties can now directly target audiences, the media is still a critical conduit through which politicians communicate with the public, but also a medium through which people are held to account. Pippa, shining example of that, and in which policies can be stress tested. So there is an editorial value the media have. In elections, I would say there's different ways in which the media plays a really important role. I think there is live television debates and big televised moments in election campaigns, which viewers, audiences, the electorate might not tune into every which way. I think it was Linton Crosby who said, what was it? People think about politics 2 minutes a week, which is very depressing when you're like me or Pip and you're thinking about it about 100 hours a week. But anyway, so there's these big live events which can genuinely shape elections. Newspapers obviously have big roles in endorsing candidates, although interestingly Ruth Davidson in our podcast Electoral Dysfunction said last week actually that she thought that this is the first general election. I'd be interested in what you think in this, Pippa, that nobody actually cares so much whether they're endorsed by an editorial or particular newspaper, because the ability to shift public opinion through print is declining. And I think the final way in which we have to try and shape coverage and influence coverage is by finding new audiences. So digital now, Sky are massive in that, podcasting, social media. So media still plays a really important role, but we also have to innovate to stay relevant. But ultimately, if you see politicians and they are having soft-soaped interviews in friendly environments, that is not, in terms of democracy, actually what's important about, you know, the fourth estate, which is to try and hold power to account and be accountable. And there still is a role for third-party players, i.e. robust media, to do that. And I would say it is, and I don't want to sound too earnest, but it is a service of democracy.
Thank you. Coming back to that point about newspapers and whether politicians are no longer valuing engaging with them, you've had huge impact with Partygate. What's your take on this?
Well, I think if you have a big story, it has an impact regardless of whichever medium it gets out to the public in, whether that's on digital or in print or on television. And of course, everyone then follows up a good story. And that obviously happens a lot with Partygate, in particular with other organisations also weighing in and breaking fresh lines on it once the ball had got rolling. It is definitely the case with the decline in print sales that a newspaper's editorial position doesn't have the impact, say, that it did when Labour were last knocking on the door of Downing Street in 1997, when Tony Blair flew all the way to an island off the coast of Australia to meet, in secret, Rupert Murdoch to try and win his support, his endorsement at the election from the Sun. And of course, the Sun did then, of course, switch and back Labour. But it's not the case, I think, that newspapers have declined in the sort of the wooing of newspaper proprietors and groups and editors in order to win the endorsement might not be quite as sort of pressing, I suppose, as it used to be. But our coverage still absolutely sets the agenda. And what I've really noticed is that often broadcasters follow up what's on the front pages of the next day's newspapers, whether that's the sort of the first bulletins in the morning across the main news channels, or indeed sort of digital outlets as well. And so I think in terms of setting the narrative and the direction of travel, and therefore by extension, the tone of the debate, I suppose, and also the the really sort of altering and managing to sort of to achieve change, then I think the front pages of newspapers still have a really big impact in that regard.
It's interesting. Coming to Debbie, very different role. You're the editor of a TV news service for a public service broadcaster and regulated. Where do you see your role within the elections?
I think for us, it's really about exposing all those different views and doing it in a way that isn't patronising, isn't telling people what to think, but just allowing them to have that breadth of ideas and thoughts that are being offered to you. And it's a little bit as well, I think, for the 5 News audience, as it has been for younger audiences that I've worked with. It's about disguising the politics and really bringing it down to stories about people, because that's what politics is. It's about people. So we have to work really hard at that on 5 News, as well as younger audiences as well. It's about really making them stories and driving home why it matters.
But that's not dumbing down at all.
No, but it can be sometimes. It can come across like that sometimes. You have to be really careful about how you explain things that are complex, things that are controversial, so it doesn't seem like you're trying to force an opinion on them. Both those audiences, they're kind of at the extremes of the age scale, but very similar. The 5 News audiences are very similar to, say, a Newsbeat audience, which, I was editor of Newsbeat in there for quite a while. And there's a difference in age, but in terms of class, social mobility, being a northern audience, having a very different take to a London metropolitan audience, you know, they're very similar, and it's got to be about stories and breaking it down to why this matters to you.
Thank you. So senior journalists who are going to be playing a leading role, also women. Clearly the electorate is 50% women. It goes down when we talked about MPs. I think it's 35% women. Georgina, we've made huge strides in representation within media, but what is the impact, do you think, of women, and have we gone far enough in our industry?
Well, it's interesting, as we were sort of thinking about today, and I was thinking about my line management chain, obviously you were at the very top of that, but between you and me, there is only one man, which is quite a remarkable thing. I mean, I'm pretty junior, and all the way up to the CEO of ITN, it's all women, which is an amazing thing. I don't think that would have been the case 10 or 15 years ago, certainly not 30 years ago. So, you know, we have to kind of recognise that that is a massive stride. I think in terms of trying to get more women into the industry, I think that's partly about how we kind of set the system up to help them. And I think, you know, one of the things, even just from my own reporting, that the statistics bear out is it's not just about men versus women in terms of pay gap and seniority. It's about mothers and non-mothers. And I think that is the really tricky situation that, you know, is going to require kind of policy brains and economics brains to really crack. But I think even just very practical things like working from home and the flexibility that that's brought, I mean, we wouldn't have predicted that. We wouldn't have wanted the pandemic to happen to bring that about, but given that it has, this is a kind of opportunity to think more kind of strategically and kind of in 3D chess about how we structure our working lives and how that fits in with family life.
Such a challenge. I think it's key having women at the most senior levels, I would say that. But Debbie, we have 4 editors at our ITN and 3 are women currently. And you know, what do you think is the impact of having women in those senior positions leading the conversations, the editorial conversations, how we're going to cover elections?
It is an entirely different conversation. You know, the more women you have in the room, it is that bringing those different thoughts together and those different approaches together and that different way of working and problem solving and being creative. There is something about the way that those minds work together in a different way. And that's not to say it should be all women in that conversation. It's that variety and that diversity at all levels that makes that conversation a worthwhile one having, and being able to feed off different points of views and different backgrounds. It's just really important for all of the industry that happens, and you move away from, you know, at the top, there just being white males, basically. And it's not happening fast enough, I don't think, but it is happening, and that's the most important thing.
Excellent. And it does change the conversation, definitely. I think we start with audiences a bit more sometimes, which I'll come back to. But we have 2 powerhouses of Westminster here, but still quite male-dominated. Beth, to kick off with you, do you think the male-dominated world of politics is changing fast enough, and political reporting?
Well, it's interesting because when I first started in the lobby in 2010, I think there were 1, maybe 2 female political editors. Now there are 10 of us, is it, Pippa, or 12? So it has changed, but women are still underrepresented in the lobby. And the other thing I would say about it is in broadcast news, the reason that broadcasters, and I agree with Pippa in everything she said about the way in which the stories that germinate in newspapers that are sometimes difficult to put on television, because television need pictures and they need interviews and they sometimes need things on record rather than the kind of off-record journalism where you find out information but it's hard to make into a television package. But in a broadcast scenario, when it's a prime ministerial press conference or it's party conference, it is television political editors that get that face time. And what I found was when Laura was at the BBC and I was at Sky, Sky sometimes doesn't get a question because they will give it to ITV and the BBC, it felt like there was good female representation. And now Laura's gone, often you can have a scenario where there's a press conference and a woman doesn't get to ask a question. I mean, Pippa, how often do you get to ask a question? 1 in 10? 1 in 8?
I think that might be more to do with who I work for than the fact I'm a woman or not. But yeah, I mean, it's not as frequently. But your point, Beth, about there being a sort of an increase in women political editors. I started the lobby in 2001, quite a long time ago. And again, there was a handful of women political editors, some real powerhouses, Eleanor Goodman, people like that. But the vast majority of them weren't mothers. And what I noticed when I remember we had a women's event at Westminster, a women journalist event, a couple of years ago, and there was at that point, I think, 9 women polids, and every single one was a mother. And I think that, to me, was sort of your point, Georgina, that was the point that was different, that you could do these jobs if you didn't have any other commitments. Now you do these jobs, you can do these jobs with those commitments as well. And I think that, the diversity that you talked about, it's still lacking in the lobby, definitely, but we are getting better in terms of male-female representation. Where we're doing badly, I think, is both in racial representation and specifically on class representation.
But just to jump in on that, I just want to go back to what Deb was saying about kind of stories and the way in which a newsroom shapes coverage by the diversity around the table. There is no better example, I don't think, that I can remember than Helen McNamara at the COVID inquiry talking about what the lack of female representation at the heart of Downing Street meant in terms of actual policy. And she effectively says women died as a result of domestic abuse during the first lockdown, partly because of a lack of diversity in which women became, in her words, invisible overnight. She was the deputy civil servant there, the number 2. And if you want to make an argument about why actually it's not just we want to have more representation, but actually why it matters in a policy terms, there is not a better example than that. And in terms of coverage, I remember doing an interview with Boris Johnson in 2021 at party conference, and I just did it on the rape statistics and the fact that the government had let women down because it was effectively being decriminalised. I think that was the Victims Commissioner, right?
I was going to ask you, because do you think the character of the lobby has changed and the sorts of questions being asked have changed by having better representation in there?
Yes, I think there's wider perspectives. But I don't think that means that they're any less hard-hitting, or Beth is living proof of that. But it definitely has changed I think having women political editors and women economics editors and women news editors and indeed women editors, my last 2 editors, Kath Feiner and obviously Alison Phillips, both women, I think it has sort of finally turned on its head that age-old perception that like the hard news jobs are done by men and the women get to do like features and lifestyle. Features and lifestyle is absolutely brilliant, by the way, and get some of the best stories through those means. This is not, I'm not trying to do it down, but certainly, I think because we now have women in jobs like ours and equivalents in other parts of the industry. We have that wider perspective, and that can only be a good thing, because look, more than half the country is women, right? And I'm not into siloing women's issues per se, but we obviously have a different lived experience from the other half of the population, and different priorities, some of us, and I think it's good that that's all reflected.
Thank you. Just going back to audiences, which obviously is the heart of everything we do. We get told a lot about audiences, and one thing that keeps coming across at the moment, that audiences are either really angry or apathetic. Debbie, what do you see? What does the Channel 5 audience think?
I think the Channel 5 audience is quite an interesting one, because they are a lot of the voters that politicians are after. So people do pay attention to what they say. They are quite conservative with a small c. And they do get incensed and angry, but also they are very much down to earth in terms of the issues are not necessarily the issues that are being played out at Westminster in terms of things like, you know, cost of living, things like wages, things like mortgages. But at the same time, there are those key issues that they are really passionate about, like immigration. So it's quite a balancing act, I think, with the Five audience, because they're quite interested in that. They are political, but they're kind of not political with the obvious political gaze, I think. So we have to tread that line between what do they want to know, what should they know, and how do we make them care about what they should know, which they're not necessarily on the face of it interested in. But yeah, they're quite angry, like everybody else seems to be angry.
Oh, as I say, Beth, your audiences, are they angry or apathetic?
I think the discussion around apathy in this election is going to be quite key, actually. And at the beginning of the year, when Keir Starmer does his kind of inaugural let's kick off the new year, a big part of his pitch there was, I know that people are angry and turned off politics, but you have to, if you want change, you have to vote for it. And the messaging coming out from Labour is that people are apathetic. When we do, this is not Sky audiences, but when we have in the political unit sort of looked into, and this can be qualitative data really, as to why people don't seem to want to turn out, it's not that they're apathetic in that they're disengaged, it's that they're apathetic because they are fed up and they're disillusioned about change. And I think part of our job, as Debbie was saying, about trying to make the arguments relevant to people and trying to engage them in politics, is also trying to adapt how we do news coverage, not to kind of what the bubble in Westminster and what we all obsess about is often quite disconnected from audiences. And you know, that's part of a reason why we're trying to do this new podcast, because I am trying to reach audiences that I wouldn't normally reach through television journalism. And to give one example, going back to things people care about, we ended up talking about Birmingham City Council and the fact they'd put up council tax bills by 30% because the council was going to go bust, and so they had to cut services and raise bills. As a political editor, I kind of knew it was going on. Had I thought about it for 5 minutes? No, I hadn't. Voice note comes in from a reader. I read up on it. I'm like, wow. I start doing some research. We talk about it in the podcast. And that clip on social had far more hits. I mean, for a little teaser, I think it had, you know, knocking on a few 100,000. And then you're like, yeah, because I'm wanging on about Rwanda and if he's going to get this bill through. And actually what people care about is what's going on with their council tax bills. And we're so in a Westminster, look, it's not, I'm not putting us down in that way. It's just if that's the agenda of the government, we have to cover major policy. But it is about trying to, I think, sometimes go to the audience as well as just transmit to the audience what so, you know, it's all learning for personally for me as well, trying to find different mediums in which you can kind of do different versions of news.
Thank you. And Georgina, Channel 4 News has a particular remit to reach, which I think is clunkily called 16 to 34-year-olds, young people. It's like holy grail. How are you doing that, and what are you seeing in relation to political coverage?
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit of a challenge because technically, I suppose some of the people in that group are old enough to be the parents of some of the people at the other end of the group. But yes, we do aim to that group. I mean, one of the things I think has been touched on is not patronising the audience, but then also trying to get through to, I think what you're both talking about with the kind of politics bubble, the Westminster bubble, is a lot of our audience feel like the issues and the policy they care about has become detached from politics. And that politics is kind of drifting off into this weird kind of twilight zone of, you know, today I'm part of the problem because today I spent the whole day making a really long list of all the MPs that have had to resign or had the whip suspended. And it's almost like a sort of time capsule. You're going through all of these horrendous, you know, headline-grabbing, terrible news events where all these individual MPs were caught doing this, that, and the other. But how many people, are waking up in the morning and thinking about Chris Pincher now? Not that many, but how many people are thinking about their council tax bill? Quite a few. And so I think trying to take it to an explaining, without patronising, meeting people where they are approach. So, one of our biggest audience now is on TikTok. You're not competing with other politicians, with political outlets, with news outlets. You are competing with, here's my makeup tutorial videos. You've got to be interesting in a way that's not just competing with media. You are competing with the most interesting content on the whole internet that is algorithmically generated to be engaging and addictive. And we've got to wheedle our way through that and say, we are still the most interesting thing you'll see today. And I think that's where we've carved out a niche, because obviously we have, Channel 4 News as a brand has this pedigree in terms of our foreign reporting. We find that's often the stories that really cut through. But you have to just kind of ride the groove of the algorithm and really kind of push your way into people's feeds and brains.
But that's not resorting to more clickbait territory either.
No, not at all. Most of the stuff that does best is very hard hitting. Like one of our, most watched TikToks of all time was explaining what is Roe v. Wade, which, okay, a lot of people in this country have probably vaguely heard of it. It got an incredible amount of pickup because people suddenly realized, oh, I've never heard about this concept before, but now, tens of millions of women in America are having, rights changed, altered, taken away forever. And they're much more interested than you might think. Even things like the budget. You wouldn't necessarily think that a TikTok audience, which is basically predominantly children, is going to care about the budget. But guess what? If you're earning less than 26 grand, your tax bills are going up because of this budget, and that's the bit that hooks you in. So the kind of punter front end, the grab at the front, and then, sneak in a bit of policy at the end.
Excellent. Sorry, Debbie, go on.
I was just going to say, I find the younger audiences so interesting because they are so passionate about a lot of these topics, but when it comes to voting on that day, do you want to sit in the park in the sun?
Yeah.
Can you be bothered to go out in the rain? And it just doesn't translate into a vote. But that doesn't mean they're not interested, because they're really passionate about some of these topics, but it's how do you make that audience see that things aren't happening for you because you don't vote, and if you voted, more things would happen for you because people would pay more attention. It's a real conundrum, I would say.
More a huge challenge for our politicians.
Motivated by issues, younger voters now, rather than political parties. And that's the challenge that the political parties face, isn't it? Is that they want to be seen, in order to secure those votes and engage people enough, young people enough, that they do actually go to the ballot box, they need to be seen as, for example, the party of climate, or the party that's going to deal with housing and people's rents. And I don't think either of the main parties are successfully getting that traction at the moment, so people just don't feel compelled to come out.
It's really difficult as well, because if you're a young person, you might like a bit of that. I want a bit of that from that party, a bit of that from that party, and that, like a Spotify playlist. You want to pick and choose your bits. So when it comes to picking one, well, I don't really feel affinity with one of them, so I might as well not bother. So it's a really tricky changing landscape, I would say.
It's fascinating. Just broadening out to that landscape and that backdrop, I suppose, of not just social media as a route to audiences, but of online abuse, of AI, of toxic debate. It's quite a tough world out there. How do you think that the campaigns and the way the elections are going to be run this year will differ from 2019 in how far we've come along that road? How ugly do you think it will be, not least given social media? Pippa, I'd love to hear from you.
So I think there's several reasons why it'll very obviously be different from 2019, and they are that there is not, well, two things really. One is that there's not one big overwhelming issue that that the core voters are motivated by, so the swing voters are motivated by, in the way that there was with Brexit in 2019. Get Brexit done was a Boris Johnson slogan which got him over the line so successfully in the Red Wall. And also, the election this time around is not going to be motivated, people are not going to be motivated as strongly as they were in 2019, because you had two main parties led by two quite divisive characters, big characters in Jeremy Corbyn and Boris Johnson, that really encourage people to vote either for them. There's a great pool amongst their core votes, but also to vote against them, and ultimately in the red wall. That's what happened with Jeremy Corbyn. This time round, there's a whole range of issues that people are concerned about, underpinned, I think, by a sort of a desire for a sense of security, and by that I mean like an economic security. Cost of living crisis has hit people really, really hard. Yes, sort of national security, in that the world is a scary place now. We've had, pandemic, we've had several wars, we're sitting on the edge of a potentially huge conflagration in the Middle East. People want a bit of security. And then the personalities bit, in Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer, there are many things, but neither is kind of like a hugely charisma-laden individual who's going to make you want to jump out of bed at 7 a.m. on polling day and run to your local primary school to mark your cross in the box. So I think in sort of real on the ground terms, those two things matter, the issues and the politics, and then the politicians rather. In terms of the type of race that we're going to see, unfortunately, I think that because of the rise of populism, the Donald Trump agenda, the Nigel Farage agenda, and to a certain extent the Boris Johnson agenda, there is a recognition, sections of the political sphere, that playbook can work in terms of getting some voters out. And while none of those characters, Nigel Farage is still a player, clearly, but in the UK, Boris Johnson is not going to be a major player this time round. That sort of style, approach, I think, lives on. And I was very struck by a Labour attack ad, was it earlier this year or end of last year, where they accused Rishi Sunak of wanting to let sex offenders go free. That I felt that was a moment where Labour potentially gave up the moral high ground, having previously had that moral high ground. And there's been a couple of examples since. So I think, as we've seen in recent days, with the Angela Rayner stuff on one hand, the Mark Menzies stuff on the other today, a lot of it does get quite personal and quite dirty. And we're in a world where the Conservative Party looks like it's coming to the end of 14 years of rule, and they will be fighting hard to hang on if they possibly can. On the other hand, Labour's potentially on the brink of a generational change, and they'll be pushing hard for that too. So they're going to use every single tactic in their playbook.
Beth, do you think it's going to be nasty?
Yeah, look, I agree with a lot of what Pip said. The first thing to say is that campaigns are nasty. So if you think that, like, the normal knockabout of politics is unpleasant, you get into a campaign, and the first one I did on television, I literally said to my producer, every day I get up, I feel like I'm putting a tin hat on to go out because of the amount of incoming you get about every single thing you do. Because when political parties know that at the end of this, people are going to the polls, the jeopardy changes, right? And then everything really, really matters. So there's a lot of pressure to make sure you get it right, but it gets nasty, and everything before feels like a phony war. The thing I would add to that, this one, hitting on what Pippa said, is this is potentially a change election. So it happens once a generation. You had 79 to 97 to potentially 2024, right? And change elections, when there could be a handover of power, are particularly nasty, because then there is so much more at stake for a Labour Party that really think that they could win and they can barely believe it, and a Conservative Party that if they're going to go down, they're going to try and take Labour down with them when they go. And just back to the thing about what Pippa was saying about attack ads, for the Conservative Party, on the 14-year record, Rishi Sunak is going to try and run a campaign of, under my leadership over the past year, you can see the economy ticking up, I've got a plane off to Rwanda, your cost of living, interest rates, things are getting better, don't risk it on that lot. But that, by its very nature, is quite a negative campaign a lot of it will be, those guys are worse than ours, right? So there's a lot of negative campaigning. And the final thing, just to pick up on what Pippa was saying about these attack ads, there was disinformation, there was actually fake II on Keir Starmer at party conference where they faked his voice. That was shut down quickly, but I was like, whoa, that's...
Sadiq Khan's another...
Yeah, Sadiq Khan, they had to take attack ads down because they were showing the New York underground. It was just actually incorrect information. Keir Starmer has done these very personal attacks on Sunak, and you look at it and you're like, this is another level of unpleasantness. I asked Starmer about this in an interview at the beginning of the year, and it was based on what Justin Welby had said about asking political players to remember that their political opponents were human and behave with decency. And this actually got picked up because I sort of said to him, what do you think of Justin Welby? You know, when they go low, we go high, you know. And he just went, absolutely not. He said, I'm going to fight fire with fire. If the government want to put fire into their attacks, they will go low. What I'm saying is, if they want to go low, we will meet that. And then he said, there's too much at stake in this election not to, right? So that was, you know, you don't often expect Starmer in a way to do that because he's kind of, you know, I'm the former, you know, director of public prosecution. There's a certain way to behave and there's rules. And there's like this political bulldog. I was like, whoa, this is out of character. But it signalled to me that we are going to be in, I think, for a really, really ugly campaign. So as well as my hard hat, I've got body armour for this one.
Bringing Georgina in, obviously dealing with fake news and propaganda is nothing new, but as we all know, the methods of mis and disinformation are becoming ever more sophisticated, and the ability for people to produce them at scale is getting easier as well. Your role is wading through all of this, and what are you seeing, what are you anticipating, what are your biggest concerns, I suppose, for the election campaigns?
Well, I might rue this in a year's time, but I feel like with AI, it's kind of an augmentation of what's already been there. I mean, we've had the ability to Photoshop an image for a long time, and you know, there haven't been so many clangers that have really derailed an election campaign or something really significant. I think the thing that worries me most, though, about the prospect of deepfake video, audio, and that sort of thing, is not that a fake thing would be believed, but that when you have a climate where anything in theory could have the accusation of deep fakery attached to it, people stop believing the true stuff. So we could painstakingly sit there and say, we've looked at this video and it's actually correct, and here's how we know we've done all the OSINT and time-stamped it, and we've got the person there and we know exactly where they were all. We've set up an entire kind of what's like a legal case, which is often what we end up doing when we're doing fact-checking. We're setting out all of the evidence, here's all of the stuff we know, and people will quite often just go, yeah, but it's deep fake, isn't it? And it's a bit like when the term fake news was invented, and of course the people who are most famously using that term are the people who are the generators of fake news, because what they've realized is if you accuse the truthful actor of fake news, that's a more powerful weapon than, you don't need to bother to fake something yourself, you just undermine the true facts of the situation.
So many angles, isn't it? But it's also this toxic culture which you were talking about, Beth, and that noise and that anger fueled by people from across the spectrum. But Beth, I'm really interested, what was your take on the Diane Abbott story recently?
Well, we were talking about that before. I mean, the Diane Abbott story, I felt was an example where this was about a donor who had made these remarks about her. They were clearly racist. And then you had this strange political dance in which it wasn't called out until actually it was Kemi Badenoch who actually did call it out, and then the Prime Minister called it out. And I think it was handled really badly. There are many, insiders would say, well, it was a cock-up, not a conspiracy, or reasons why, but I just think that doesn't cut much sway with a lot of people that just found it completely disgusting. I think also part of the issue around all of this story for Diane was that she's politically homeless at the moment. So, you know, normally when those sorts of attacks happen in that way, you might have a party machine coming in behind you and calling it out quickly in a way that it gets dealt with. I think the one positive I would argue that came out of this, I don't know what you think about this, Pippa, was that, you know, Diane Abbott was the first black female MP. She's had more abuse than anyone else has had, and she has had the Labour whip removed from her, hasn't she? And this has been going on for nearly a year or over a year.
A year tomorrow, I think.
Yes. And so what it did was, in a way, it put Diane Abbott back into the spotlight in a way I imagine she really did not want to be. And she said, I think, that she felt afraid, which is a horrible, horrible thing for anyone to feel because they are in a public office. But actually, I think that what will come from this is that the Labour Party will try and resolve this. And I imagine that Diane Abbott will get the whip back. I really think that it's very hard for the Labour Party not to restore the whip for her. And I think that that's what will happen. And I think given the years of service, she apologised as well for the remarks she made, didn't she? She apologised immediately. There's a process going on. I don't know the ins and outs of it. And it could be more complicated legally than we understand. But I think the one sort of glimmer in that big, horrible cloud is that her, you know, she was back in the public eye, and there was, you know, Jess Phillips actually on the podcast. I'm not just here to plug the podcast, right? But Jess actually, Jess and Diane have some history, right? They publicly do not get on. And Jess said in the podcast, you know, she said, I've disagreed with Diane. It was abject racism. She deserves to be able to kind of end her career if she decides to retire at this point. I don't know if she will or won't. She might well not. She's actually my local MP. You know, that she should have the whip restored. And I think there is a sentiment in the Labour Party that MPs would like to see that happen.
Interesting one to watch. Thank you, panel. I'm really keen that we have some questions from the audience. I'm sure you've got lots of things you'd like to ask of anybody. Do we have microphones? Brilliant, lovely. I was looking at the front, and the hands seem to go up first. So if you wouldn't mind coming around here.
Hello.
Front row and then the second row. It would be fantastic if you could give us your name or anything pertinent and your question.
Hi, I'm Laura Griffiths. I'm not a journalist. 2 questions. Firstly, in the context of the increasing vote share for reform, could you drill down on the geographics of where the vote is going to be highly contested in party political terms? Do you expect any form of concession coalition? So I'm thinking Red Wall, also Southwest. Secondly, could you comment on women's likely representation going into the election in terms of what the parties have done to promote women on their lists? And secondly, if you have any sense that that representation is going to be affected by women being targeted, particularly by social media attack, etc.
Great questions, lots in there. I might go to Pippa first on the sort of first 2 parts of that.
Okay, so yeah, I mean, reform is fascinating. I mean, they're doing the job that UKIP did a decade ago, and making the sort of the centre of the Conservative Party feel very anxious about what's going on the right flank. And it's so interesting watching the response, which is to kind of move to the right, completely ignoring the one truism of general elections in this country, that you win from the centre. And we saw it with Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party moving to the left. And we're seeing it now with Rishi Sunak, and particularly some legislation like the Rwanda bill, and the way that sort of like some of the language, the rhetoric that's been used around immigration, you know, people like Suella Braverman and so on the Tory right, and sort of how it feels sometimes that Sunak's in hock to them. That will also, I think, influence the tone of the election, the fact that the Tories are scared of reform. When you talk about a coalition, did you mean agreement between reform and the Tories, or do you mean a sort of a progressive alliance? Yeah. So So I think on the reform bit, I think they've said, Richard Tice has said that there's not going to be any sort of, we're not going to stand so that, Tories can win the seat, they can take the vote. But on the Progressive Alliance point, because we get this quite a lot, why don't the Green Party, the Labour Party, the Lib Dems work together in a particular constituency to beat the Conservatives? Well, I think there's several, and I'm quite against the idea of a Progressive Alliance, because even though I clearly am on the progressive side of opinion, because I think voters can do it for themselves. And I think voters don't like being told how they should vote. And why should they be, frankly? It's up to them. And what they've shown us in seats like, well, there's been countless seats, but half of the by-elections we've had recently, going back from Chesham and Amersham onwards, is that voters aren't stupid, they can work it out. They can work it out that actually, even if they're a lifelong Labour voter, if they vote Lib Dem this time, then they can, get a progressive member of Parliament and get rid of the Conservative. Or indeed, other by-elections with the Conservatives that we've seen, and Labour rather, that we've seen recently. So I think there's unlikely to be any sort of formal coalition, but I do think the voters will work out for themselves how to get the result that they most want.
Thank you. And
just quickly on the reform question, which is, I'm fascinated by reform, both in what happens in this election, but also the way in which the fear of reform within the Conservative Party now is going to affect potentially the next Conservative Party leadership election. But what's interesting about reform, if you think that the predecessor was the Brexit Party, back in 2019, they did a deal where they said, we will not stand candidates in seats where there is a Conservative who is a Brexiteer, right? This time around, what Richard Tice, the leader, is saying very clearly is, we are going to fight them in every seat. They have broken their promises. They basically, what he said, we want to destroy the Conservative Party. It's almost like they want to launch a reverse takeover into the Conservative Party. So it's going to be a very different sort of election. Now, of course, one of Nigel Farage's big laments in life is that, he got 4 million votes. It's a point. He got 4 million votes in 2019 or whatever, and no seats at all, right? So whether they get seats is a totally different matter. But I think that what you will see is in those red wall areas, those Brexiteer-facing areas of the country, what you're going to see is this kind of voters that feel let down, the levelling up stuff didn't happen, Brexit wasn't maybe what they imagined, Boris Johnson isn't there, who was a talisman for some people in those seats. They liked Boris Johnson, now they've got Rishi Sunak, that's not maybe their guy, right? So I think you're going to see these fascinating battles in which is what happens, that the Reform Party split that coalition that Boris Johnson somehow put together in 2019, and then Labour through the middle. On the issue of women representation, it's a good question, and that's the sort of subject I used to do a lot more on when there was far less representation in the Conservative Party, so I did quite a lot of work on that in 2015, for example. I think this time around, the fact that Labour commit to having all women shortlists and women, female candidates, given the projections about where the polls are going, you might see quite a big uptick of female representation in Parliament if Labour do as well as the polls are suggesting, simply because they will field, due to their selection processes, more female candidates than the Conservative Party tend to.
thank you very much. Second row.
Thank you. Hello, Dixie Stewart from Sandstone Global. I worked for many years at the BBC on a project called 50/50, which was designed to drive gender representation. Debbie will remember it, and I remain very grateful for her support. I'm just wondering if the panel could tell us about the interventions that they use to ensure that women really do get a chance to shape the news agenda.
Debbie, I'll pass that.
Okay. I think it is, for me, coming from the same background, it's with an eye on that same sort of process of making sure we're checking, and at the beginning of the day, we're talking and looking through our lists about the voices we are having on air, and just really building up our lists of people who come back to us who are, experts and in the field, especially of politics. It can be quite tricky sometimes, but I think we do okay because we do monitor it daily. So it's not something that is an afterthought anymore. It's pretty much ingrained, and everybody knows that's what we do. So in some ways it's got simpler, but I can't remember who mentioned about women being mums and the part-time elements of how that plays out. Actually, if you're somebody who's running a team, it really affects in terms of your staffing, who gets on air, and you've got to work harder because all the men are full-time, all the women are part-time, and it's really quite tricky. So you've got to think of it in the round, as well as your contributors, who's on that day, what shifts you're putting people on, when are you giving people days off, or else you can end up with a day where you've got sort of one female reporter or on-air staff and everybody else is male, and then, it can be really, really tricky, but you just have to, as organisations, be better at this, and that involves everyone, thinking from the people who book your freelancers to etc. So.
I'm just bringing Georgina here. Certainly all the newsrooms at ITN, as you say, debrief it every single day and break down on screen, as in our staff, our freelancers, experts, case studies and vox pops, and they all have to come to me at 10 o'clock the next morning and report back on it. And there's interesting conversations, because recently the stories have been a certain type of story, and there's been it's been stubbornly male is the comment that I've been saying a lot. But what conversations do you have in your editorial meetings, Georgina, and around?
Yeah, I think it's just being self-conscious about it and not being afraid to say, have we got enough women? Have we got enough ethnic diversity? Are we talking to people who don't live in London? Are we talking to people from all different walks of life? And not feeling like, this is a sort of corporate jargon, but this is just everyday part of doing the job, and that part of doing the job well is having those conversations in a sort of unabashed way. I mean, actually only today we had the editorial diversity meeting about, are we having, as well as the right conversations about who's doing things, are we discussing the topics broadly enough, and are we having enough diverse voices as well as diverse individuals? It's kind of, I think, just leaning in, sorry to use that phrase, but leaning into it and being deliberate about it rather than reversing into it.
I think also being bold when it comes to recruitment. Don't necessarily recruit someone that's just like you. You don't need another middle-class Scot in her late 40s with 3 children. You need, people with different life experiences, different backgrounds. My core team of 7 reporters, 5 of us are women, 2 are men. And I think we've got the most women in any team on the print side in the lobby. And actually, newspapers can hide a little bit in the way that broadcasters can't, because, broadcasters, you're on screen, everyone can see what age you are, what race you are, what your sex is. So I think you really need to be sort of actively promote, and actually, ultimately, bosses come into it as well. And I'm very lucky that I've got a female editor-in-chief, a female head of news, I'm a woman political editor. My predecessors, Anushka Asthana, now in your stable, and Heather Stewart, Kath Viner, our editor, decided that she wanted them to both to flourish and to be able to have a sort of a platform as senior political journalists. So she agreed to do, for them to do a job share as political editors. They both worked 4 days a week. One of them was in charge 3 days a week and the other was in charge 2. And it just meant that they had room not just to report on the big stories of the day, but also to do their own investigative stuff and, crucially, have time with their kids. And, that worked for as long as, they were both there. So it is possible. You just need to sometimes think outside the box in who you recruit and to do what job.
Thank you. I think I've got time for 2 more questions. Oh gosh, how on earth do I
Let's be really quick with our answers.
And I'm going to go there, and then I will come back over there.
Yeah, perfect. Hi, my name is Sholope Latache. I'm a freelance journalist. I'm going to take it to politics again, so please forgive. But I guess for Beth and Pippa, what do you think is the likelihood of Rishi Sunak not sitting in that seat before we have an election?
question. Do you want to go first?
So you're asking me about a confidence vote and whether he might lose his job? Thanks. Moving on.
Put a percentage of it. Out of 10, what are the chances?
It's low. It's very low, but look, I don't rule anything out. No, no, to answer genuinely, I think dependent on how the local elections go, he could well face a confidence vote. You cannot rule it out, because in a world in which the Conservatives do really badly but also lose some of these key mayoral seats, so the West Midlands Mayor and Teesside, it might be by accident rather than design, because I don't think there's a big organised movement trying to oust him in a way that Boris Johnson had serious ops going on, didn't they, in 2019? And it still took months and months and months to dislodge Theresa May. But people can panic and the letters go in and you have a confidence vote. That said, I think he would win a confidence vote and carry on. It might be that instead of having a confidence vote, he decides to trigger a general election. Just, it's so unpredictable. But I do think that there is a risk that he faces that challenge of the vote. And actually, there was a poll out today, which you would have seen, Pippa, that put the Conservatives on 19%. And that is the sort of poll that makes MPs go mad, because they are so scared that they're going to lose. You've got to think it's their livelihood. It might be a job that they've done for a decade, and they're staring down the barrel of potentially losing a seat that they would have thought 6 months ago was totally safe. And then they start to behave in a way where they think, well, roll of the die, let's try another leader. So I do think it's possible, but I have learned in this 4 years of roller coaster politics, in fact 10 years if you go back, like, don't make predictions, because events don't, yeah. What do you think?
And this is being recorded, so
well, I think Beth answered that brilliantly. Why do we have more questions instead of me saying pretty much the same thing?
Perfect.
Because I've been over in the red jumper.
Thank you. My name is Patricia Vincent, lead interview on acceleratingwomen'senterprise.uk. My question is for you, Georgina, on the undermining of truth. What strategies or approaches have you been using or you think can be used? Thank you.
Well, other than sort of banging heads against brick walls, the actual constructive approach that we take is accepting that you're not going to be able to fact check everything. So, you know, our output is about politician says X, is this either true, misleading, unreliable, etc. We can't get to everything because the sheer volume of rubbish in the world is very high, and the sheer volume of stuff that might be interesting to discuss is very high. So what we do is, rather than trying to take a comprehensive approach, we try and make sure that everything that we're doing is giving people the tools so that next time you encounter something, you've kind of got that literacy about, okay, so-and-so cited a statistic there, you know, here's how I might, as a layperson, just go and Google that myself, and what are the facts on the, you know, background to that policy. So we're trying to kind of, in a way, arm people with the techniques that they would need to do what we do anyway. One of the ways we do it is every fact check article or piece of output that you see from us will show the workings. I think that's one of the things that people get fed up with, you know, when they say, you know, raging against the MSM as they see it, is that they feel like they're being asked to accept things as true without being shown why they're true and how we've got to that process. And I think a lot of where we've found success is showing people, okay, this is actually how we verified this information, and this is how we checked that fact. And once you show people that, they realize it's not this kind of murky world. It's actually something they can do for themselves. So the next time, you know, they're listening to PMQs, they know, okay, I could go onto the government website, or I can look at something from the IFS, and I might not understand every little intricacy of it, but I can kind of navigate my way.
Thank you. I know I said that those are the last two. I should be able to stick to time working in telly, but I can't. I'm just going to go to Sian, who will know how to do a very quick final question.
To know what the panel's one piece of advice is to women journalists here about the toxicity that you will, because we know that women are disproportionately targeted in terms of toxic abuse, especially in a febrile atmosphere, which we're going to see, and women of colour even more so. How best do you think women journalists can prepare for the onslaught they might get psychologically?
This is a huge topic and you're going to have to do it super quick each. It's like 10 seconds each.
I would say don't bite and don't let your, partially your ego, force you to interact with that person, because you're not going to win. So don't bite.
I'd agree with that, and I'd say, I'd add, have each other's backs, and that would be different things for different people. In some cases, it is being the shoulder to cry on when someone's really upset by something they've seen. In the other cases, it is standing up and defending a more junior or younger journalist who doesn't feel they're in a position to do it themselves. And just look out for each other.
And my advice would be both of those things. Don't bite, I think, is critical, because actually people often abuse you because they want to draw you into something so it creates more energy, and it's just energy you're wasting when you could just be focusing on great journalism. And the second thing is put on all your filters. So actually put a digital wall around yourself, so you're doing your work and you're interacting with people that give you positive energy, and you are kind of sealing yourself off a bit from the abuse, because you don't need to see it. It's a waste of your time, but you have to accept it's going to happen, and you just have to, I think, try and shut it out.
And Georgina?
I think the thing that I find most helpful is to remember that the people that are commenting are not the majority of people that are reading your stuff. I mean, they are, if anything, if you can have a vast minority, they are overwhelmed by the number of people who are just reading it and thinking, that was a really useful piece of journalism, thank you. So just remember those silent people.
Thank you. Great last question. And it's good to end with some advice from such a brilliant panel. Thank you for all your insights. I have to say that covering elections is one of the most exciting things to do. And I know that we've talked about how ugly this is potentially going to be and how difficult, but I, for one, am feeling reassured that we've got such capable hands here who will be guiding our coverage across all sorts of mediums. So thank you for that. I've got a load more thank yous, I'm afraid. Thank you to all of you for coming and everybody online. Thank you again to PepsiCo, our headline sponsor for the evening, and for Cision. And also to St John's, who've donated this space. And some of you will be familiar with it, but for those who aren't, for nearly 200 years, this church has been at the heart of the South Bank, acting in all sorts of capacities, from bomb shelter in the Second World War to day centre for homeless people, an arts and music hub, and hosting important events like the Daphne Festival, which is commemorating the assassination of the Maltese investigative journalist Daphne Caruana Galizia, sorry, a terrible pronunciation there. I'd also like to thank UCAB Gravina, Artistic Director, for this wonderful venue. On behalf of Widge, thank you for coming. We have a load more Widge events online and in person coming up that really cover a whole load of areas, from supporting careers at all stages, as well as giving us the chance to meet up and network. We've got masterclasses coming up in everything from how to pitch to editors, how to earn more as a freelance and a staff member, which is slightly terrifying, how to build your social media profile, how to get the best out of everyone you interview, how to boost your resilience, and discover your many transferable skills. We've also got events coming up marking Southeast Asian Heritage and Black History Months. We've got a speed mentoring event sponsored by Tesco, who are here tonight. Welcome. How to build your journalism into a business. And of course, we'll have the famous Widge Summer Party. So I really hope to see some or all of you at these events. All the details on these are on the website, so if you have a look there. If you're not a member, please do join. We really are, I think, one of the best and most active media organisations in a really, really practical way that works for its members in all these different areas. So quite enough from me. Thank you all again. I hope some of you will stick around for some crisps and a few drinks, and for any of the panel who can stay to chat as well. Debbie has to run off for very good reasons, so won't be joining us, but I'm hoping everyone else will. But thank you again.